All right, everybody, buckle up because this deep dive is going to feel like something straight out of fiction. We're talking about the Rothschilds. You know the name, right? Whispered in history books, at the heart of conspiracy theories, the whole shebang.
It's true. They really do occupy this weird space in our collective imagination.
And you guys sent over a ton of stuff about him, including these excerpts from a source titled, wait for it, The Banking Empire of Rothschild.
Okay, gotta admit, that spelling always makes me chuckle.
Right. It's like they couldn't decide between Rothschild and Rockefeller. But hey, we're here for the facts, not the typos, so let's dig into what makes this family historically significant and why their story still matters today.
Well, the first thing to understand is that their story is much bigger than just one family getting rich. We're talking about how power worked in a completely different era, the 18th century. Before Twitter, before instant news,
Yeah.
knowing something before everyone else was everything.
It was like the ultimate insider trading, but on a global scale. So where do we even begin with a family like this?
It all starts, like so many stories, with a young man named Mayer Amschel Rothschild, born in 1744, right in the heart of the Jewish ghetto in Frankfurt.
Now, that's a detail I kept seeing pop up in my research. It's not just about setting the scene, is it? It speaks volumes about the challenges they faced right from the start.
Absolutely. We're talking about a time when Jewish communities faced severe limitations, property ownership, access to professions. Everything was restricted. And it's against this backdrop that Mayer Amschel's ambition begins to take shape.
It's almost like their rise to prominence becomes even more extraordinary when you consider the obstacles they had to overcome just to exist in that world.
Precisely. And one of the first things that struck me in the source material was the origin of their name, Rothschild.
Oh, you mean how it literally translates to red shield in German?
Exactly. And the seemingly small detail actually gives us a glimpse into their early beginnings. Their family home in Frankfurt was likely marked with a red shield, which would have served as a visual marker for their budding business.
I love that. Those little visual cues that connect us back to the past. It's like their own personal logo, long before branding was even a thing. But you can't talk about the Rothschilds without talking about their bread and butter 18th century banking. And from what I've gathered, it was a far cry from our modern day experience.
Oh, absolutely. Forget online transfers and ATMs. We're talking about managing vast fortunes for nobility, navigating a chaotic world of currencies before standardized systems.
Sounds more like financial alchemy than banking.
And if that weren't enough, they were also involved in, get this, financing wars.
Whoa, hold on. Financing wars? That sounds like a high-stakes game even for the Rothschilds.
It was, but it was also their launch pad to power. Think about it. When nations go to war, who needs money? Everyone. And the Rothschilds, with their growing network and keen business sense, were ready to provide it.
They saw an opportunity in the chaos and weren't afraid to seize it. But there's one name that keeps popping up in connection with their rise to power, a certain Prince William of Hesse-Kassel.
Ah, yes, Prince William. Now, he wasn't just any prince. We're talking about one of the wealthiest men in Europe at the time.
All right, so we've got royalty, wealth. What's the Rothschild connection?
Well, Prince William's fortune came from a rather unique source, renting out his army as mercenaries. He essentially profited from war itself.
Wow, renting out an army, that's a business model I haven't heard of. And Mayer Amschel was managing the finances of someone who profited from conflict? Talk about being in the right place at the right time, especially as Europe was about to get swept up in the Napoleonic Wars. So we've got Europe teetering on the edge of war, a prince who, let's face it, kind of sounds like he's straight out of Game of Thrones, profiting from all that chaos. And then we have Mayer Amschel Rothschild right in the thick of it. What happens next?
Okay, so this is where things get really interesting. Because it's not just Mayer Amschel calling all the shots anymore. This is where the Rothschild family network really comes into play.
Ah, so it becomes a family affair? Was this like their version of a hostile takeover, divide and conquer?
Not quite. Picture this Mayer Amschel's sons, strategically placed in major cities across Europe. We're talking London, Paris, Vienna, Naples. They were everywhere.
Okay, so less like a hostile takeover, more like they were playing a real-life game of Risk, but with banks instead of armies. Although, come to think of it, they kind of had armies too, with the whole mercenary thing going on.
It's true, the lines do get blurry. But what's important here is the strategic brilliance of it all. Remember those information gaps we were talking about?
Yeah.
In the age of slow communication, knowing what was happening before your rivals, across borders, that was the real power move.
Ah, so while Napoleon's out there marching across Europe, disrupting trade routes left and right, the Rothschilds are already 2 steps ahead.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just about having the information. It was about what they did with it. Take Nathan Rothschild in London, for instance. Not only was he financing the British war effort,
Which, gotta say, is a pretty good gig if you can get it.
right, but he was also heavily involved in the booming textile industry. And, here's the kicker, the incredibly lucrative smuggling operations going on during Napoleon's continental system.
Okay, now you're speaking my language, smuggling.
Hmm.
Tell me more about this continental system, though. It rings a bell, but our listener might not be up on their Napoleonic trade wars.
Totally. Basically, the continental system was Napoleon's attempt to cripple Britain's economy, block their ships from European ports, cut off trade, the whole shebang.
So basically a giant embargo. I get it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And while it created chaos for a lot of people, it also created opportunity. See, suddenly there was this huge demand for goods that were otherwise unavailable. And Nathan, with his vast network and, let's be honest, a willingness to bend the rules a bit.
He was like the OG pirate of finance.
Well, he was certainly resourceful. He managed to keep those goods flowing, raking in profits while others struggled.
That's wild. It's like we stumbled onto the set of an international spy thriller instead of a history deep dive.
I told you. The Rothschilds are the stuff of legends. And speaking of legends, we can't forget the most famous Nathan Rothschild story, the tale of how he supposedly made a killing off the Battle of Waterloo.
Oh yeah, the Waterloo story. The one that gets passed around like some kind of financial folklore.
Exactly. So the legend goes like this. Through his intricate web of agents, and get this, carrier pigeons, Nathan gets word of Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo before anyone else.
Okay, gotta give him props for the carrier pigeons. That's next level communication right there.
Right. But here's where it gets wild. Instead of, celebrating this victory with his fellow Brits, he heads straight to the London Stock Exchange and starts selling off all his British bonds.
Wait, selling his bonds? Wouldn't a British victory mean those bonds are about to skyrocket in value?
Exactly. But his move causes a frenzy. People panic, assuming Nathan knows something they don't, that Britain actually lost, so they start selling their bonds too.
And I'm sensing a but coming here. Because, of course, Nathan is in on the truth the whole time.
Ding, ding, ding. The price of British bonds plummets, and then who swoops in and buys them all up for pennies on the pound?
Nathan Rothschild, mastermind extraordinaire. Okay, I gotta ask, how much of this is true? Did he really play the entire London Stock Exchange like a fiddle?
Well, like most good stories, this one's been embellished over time. While Nathan was undoubtedly a savvy businessman who profited from the war, there's no concrete evidence to support the whole Waterloo scheme.
Ah, so maybe not a real-life Gordon Gekko after all.
Maybe not. But here's the thing. Even without the dramatic flair of the Waterloo story, the Rothschilds' real success came from something much more enduring. Information was their game, and they were masters of it.
So it wasn't just luck, it was strategy, foresight, and connections. They had the world in their sights and a plan for every scenario.
Absolutely. And by the time the Napoleonic Wars finally ended, the Rothschilds had cemented themselves as the most informed and arguably most powerful banking family in Europe. But, it's one thing to finance wars and amass wealth. It's a whole other thing to use that influence to shape the world around you.
It's like they went from kingmakers to wanting to be kings themselves.
In a way. And yet,
Yeah.
and there was this one detail I kept coming back to in the source material that really highlights this. Mayor Amschel's dedication to advocating for Jewish rights. It feels like a very different side of the family, doesn't it?
It does. Considering their, shall we say, flexible approach to rules and regulations when it came to business dealings.
It's a side of their story that often gets overshadowed, but it's absolutely critical to understanding their legacy. Remember how Mayor Amschel started out in the Frankfurt ghetto, subject to those discriminatory laws?
Yeah, talk about starting from the bottom.
Right, and it's ironic, isn't it, that Napoleon, the same guy whose wars they profited from, also inadvertently helped challenge those very restrictions.
Wait, really? How did that happen?
Well, Napoleon's conquests, as messy and destructive as they were, also helped spread those core ideas of the French Revolution. Liberty, equality, all that jazz, which included greater freedoms for Jewish communities.
Oh, wow. So it's like this weird unintended consequence of all the fighting.
Exactly. And Mayor Amschel, savvy as ever, he recognized this opportunity. He leveraged his newfound influence to push for things like property rights, the ability to work outside the ghetto walls. It's actually pretty remarkable.
Talk about seizing the moment. But it begs the question, was it genuine altruism or just another strategic power play? I guess that's a debate for the history books, huh?
Exactly. And it speaks to the enduring mystery of the Rothschilds. Were they ruthless opportunists? Or visionaries who helped shape a better future? Maybe a bit of both. But either way, one thing's for sure, building wealth and influencing society is one hell of a feat. Ensuring that legacy continues for generations. That's a whole other ballgame.
It's like they wrote the book on building a dynasty.
And a lot of that can be traced back to one single document, Mayor Amschel's will.
A will that shaped a dynasty. That's giving off some serious succession vibes. What was in this thing? Some secret treasure map to untold riches?
Not quite a treasure map, but just as valuable. It was all about control. Mayor Amschel, he knew the real threat to the family fortune wasn't outsiders, it was infighting.
Ah, the old shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations problem.
Exactly. So he crafted this will, not just to divvy up the money, but to keep the family united, powerful, for generations to come.
Okay, so less about hidden fortunes, more about family business 101. But on a Rothschild scale, what kind of rules are we talking about here?
Well, one of the most, let's say, eye-catching aspects was the exclusion of women from any leadership roles. Only his sons could inherit and run the businesses.
Whoa, wait, seriously, talk about a boys' club, no daughters allowed. I mean, I know it was a different time, but still.
Yeah, not exactly progressive by today's standards.
Yeah.
And it gets even wilder. Not only were daughters out of the running, Mayor Amschel actually encouraged, even insisted on, marriages within the family.
You're kidding. Cousins marrying cousins. Sounds like something out of a Jane Austen novel, but with way higher stakes.
Right. But his logic was clear. Keep the wealth, the secrets, the power, all within the Rothschild circle.
Gotta admit, it's a pretty effective way to build a firewall around your empire, even if it is a tad morally questionable. And it seemed to work. The Rothschild name throughout the 19th century, it became synonymous with wealth and influence on a scale that's almost hard to grasp.
Oh, absolutely. And they weren't just bankers anymore. We're talking railroads, mines, investments across the globe. They understood that to stay on top, you had to diversify.
Speaking of diversification, you mentioned the source I sent over talked about their involvement in the diamond mines of South Africa. That's a whole other can of worms.
All right. It just goes to show how far their reach extended. And it makes you think about the legacy of a family like this, the good, the bad, the complicated.
Yeah, it's not all champagne and caviar, is it? But even empires crumble eventually. What happened to the Rothschild dynasty? Did they finally meet their match?
Well, they faced their share of challenges, as you'd expect over such a long history. The world wars were particularly devastating, especially for their Vienna branch.
That's right. I read about one of the Rothschilds being kidnapped. It sounded more like a movie plot than real life.
Oh, that's the story of Louis Rothschild, head of the Vienna branch. In 1938, he was kidnapped by the Nazis, held for a ransom of $21 million.
21 million in the 1930s. That's got to be some kind of record.
It was the most expensive kidnapping in history at the time, and a stark reminder that even unimaginable wealth offered little protection in the face of that kind of hatred and violence.
It's a sobering thought, makes you realize that money and power, they can only shield you from so much. So where does that leave the Rothschilds today? Are they still operating in the shadows, pulling the strings of global finance like some of those conspiracy theories suggest?
Well, their influence isn't what it once was, that much is for sure. But they're still major players in banking, philanthropy, even the wine industry. It seems some things never go out of style.
From high finance to fine wines, they really have done it all. But I'm guessing their fortune today is a far cry from those wild claims of controlling trillions of dollars that you see floating around online.
Let's just say the reality is a bit more down to earth than those conspiracy theories would have you believe. What's fascinating to me is how their name still holds so much power. They've become almost mythical figures, this symbol of a certain kind of wealth and influence.
It's true. The Rothschilds, they're more than just a family, more than just a name. They're a story that's captured imaginations for centuries and shows no signs of fading away.
And that's the power of a good story, isn't it? It gets passed down, evolves, takes on a life of its own, and in a way, that might be the most enduring legacy of the Rothschilds.
That's a wrap on this deep dive into the world of the Rothschilds. Hopefully, you're walking away with more questions than answers and a newfound appreciation for this family that's been both revered and reviled throughout history. Remember, the story doesn't end here. Go out there, keep digging, keep questioning, and who knows, you might just uncover your own piece of the Rothschild enigma.